In an unwavering attempt to embrace ancient power symbols, the Egyptian obelisk has been the subject of widespread displacement. We see the obelisk as glorified entrance points, but was there a much more productive means to the existence of such intricately cut stone? In the today and now, to transport electricity, we need massive pylons. In ancient times, the obelisks were the pylons of their day. You have to wonder that if the Great Pyramid was a power plant that was part of a world grid in the extremely remote past, then perhaps these giant works of solid granite with their golden tips were the wireless receivers that linked this type of grid. Of course, such a theory is highly controversial, but it is also the only theory that makes logical sense as to what was going on in these times and why the scale of which these structures were built was nothing short of epic. The Unfinished Obelisk is thought to have been commissioned for placement at Karnak, where Hatshepsut had already raised the monument known today as the Lateran Obelisk, which was moved to Rome in the 4th century by Constantius II. The Unfinished Obelisk measures 137 feet and is approximated to weigh 1,200 tons. Work on the monument was abandoned when it cracked while being carved, and so it remains in situ, just as it was left thousands of years ago when the workers walked away from it. Marks from ancient tools and workers' measurement markings are clearly visible on the piece and provide insight into how obelisks were quarried. The unfinished obelisk that is still in the quarried state at Aswan is sensational for many reasons. The copper chisels that are said to have cut into this stone wouldn't have worked. The chisels would have completely blunted after having close to no effect on the stone. The same goes for the dolerite hammer theory. Pounding the dolerite on the granite is pretty futile, and to say they accomplished these cuts with these techniques is astonishing. And stone experts and engineers the world over all agree that only a diamond cutting technique would work with machine repetition. Other anomalies of the obelisk are the raising of these things, and also how they got the stone so smooth that it is finished to the highest standards possible. And we are meant to believe this was done with handheld tools that are so primitive that we class cavemen as having used them. They are telling us that this happened at the dawn of civilization? No, not buying it. So what are the obelisks, you may wonder? Would it surprise you to learn that the enigmatic features are a representation of the arrival of the Bennu? Wait till you hear this. The god Atum stood on the primordial mound at the creation of the world when he arrived on the Bennu. The obelisks are incredible representations of this, and you just have to wonder if these are in fact depictions of spacecraft. All across the world today, we see these great obelisks spread far and wide, and they were all taken from Egypt. The Romans took 13 to Italy, and there is one in the Vatican City. You have to wonder what else the Romans took from Egypt. Is it possible that all the knowledge from the Great Library was also taken to Rome and hidden in the now Great Library of the Vatican for posterity? The greatest empires from the past 2,000 years have taken these things to signify the new age of power, and in the greatest cities of the world, including London, Paris, and New York City, the obelisk in London and New York are a pair. The one in Paris is also part of a pair originally from a different site in Luxor, where its twin remains. Although all three of the Cleopatra Needless are genuine ancient Egyptian obelisks, their shared nickname is a misnomer, as they have no connection with the Ptolemaic Queen Cleopatra of Egypt, and were already over 1,000 years old in her lifetime. An earlier reference states Queen Cleopatra brought the London obelisk from Heliopolis to Alexandria shortly before the time of Christ for the purposes of decorating a new temple, but it was never erected and lay buried in the sand on the shore until given to the British in 1820. These things are symbolizing power in different senses. The first symbol of power being literal for receiving and transporting energy, and the second power symbol is the sign of power and wealth. In both cases, and for whatever reason may be correct for this undertaking, it doesn't deflect the utterly astonishing amount of effort that would be involved to create these things, and this raises the question that suggests they were something more. They were associated with the Bennu Bird, the Egyptian precursor to the Greek phoenix. According to some Egyptian myth, the Bennu Bird was the first living creature whose cry awoke creation and set life in motion. The bird was linked to the morning star and the renewal of each day, but was also the sign of the end of the world. In the same way the bird cried to begin the creative cycle, she would sound again to signal its completion. The Egyptians believed a day would come when the gods would die and all would return to the uniformity of primordial chaos. The Bennu Bird would not choose this end of its own, but would be given its cue by the sun god Ra, who, in turn, would have been informed by the god Thoth, keeper of the records of humans and gods. From the pyramid text onward, the Bennu Bird was closely associated with the creator sun god. In Heliopolis, the center of solar worship, the Bennu Bird was said to perch on the Benben stone, a kind of primitive obelisk. The quartering, transport, and raising of an obelisk is well documented through inscriptions, drawings, and official letters on the subject, but no specific mention is made of how exactly the obelisk was raised to position on its base. Other descriptions of the funnel-shaped hole draws on ancient Egyptian sources, which would seem to indicate that the base of the obelisk was beneath the ramp and covered with sand. The bottom of the obelisk would be positioned over this hole and sand removed slowly to raise the monument while, presumably, workmen with ropes carefully guided the obelisk as it rose. It must be said, however, that this has been tested many times with machinery, an expert engineer, and builders over a prolonged period of time, and at no point was it agreed that this would work, and in fact, it was a struggle to raise a 300-pound concrete obelisk, so how were they raising them in excess of 1,000 tons? The dynastic Egyptian hieroglyphic inscriptions on this part of the process are unclear. However, and the problem with assuming the funnel-shaped hole in the ramp clarifies anything is that this hole would have been of considerable depth to aid in raising a 100-foot tall monument. There would have had to have been some kind of groove to prevent slippage on the base, and workers would have needed to find some way to pull the obelisk upright once it had attained a certain height and angle. Modern attempts to replicate this process have failed. In 1955, a NOVA team with archaeologist Mark Lanier attempted to raise an obelisk based on the Egyptian sources and failed. When they used more modern techniques, they failed as well. The funnel-shaped hole and sand would only have to be deep enough to bring the edge of the bottom of the obelisk down to the edge of a groove in the base, but this did not work. Further, the angle of the obelisk as it was rising stopped at 40 degrees, and the modern-day workers with their ropes could find no way to raise it further. In 2001, abandoning the ancient sources, aeronautics professor Maury Garib and a team raised a 6,900-pound obelisk using kites, a pulley system, and a support frame. Harnessing wind power and calculating leverage needed for the pulley system carefully, the obelisk was raised in 25 seconds. Garib claims that this was most likely how the ancient obelisks were raised, as well as how the pyramid and temples of Egypt were built. This claim, however, is entirely speculative, as there is no records indicating a use of kites in construction in ancient Egypt in dynastic times. Bunson's description, although specifically citing Thebes, would have applied to any of the sites where obelisks were found. Although they were primarily raised at Karnak, they were also positioned outside of many temples, from Heliopolis near modern Cairo in Lower Egypt to Elephantine in Upper Egypt near Aswan. The enigmatic stone boxes at Elephantine Island could be further representation of the Benben, and indeed a solid depiction of the craft that brought people to the earth. Only 8 obelisks remain in Egypt, and the rest are scattered across the world. It may interest you to learn that in 250 BC, Eratosthenes used an obelisk to calculate the circumference of the earth. He knew that at noon on the summer solstice, obelisk in the city of Swanet, modern-day Aswan, would cast no shadow because the sun would be directly overhead. He also knew that at that very same time in Alexandria, obelisk did cast shadows. Measuring that shadow against the tip of the obelisk, he came to the conclusion that the difference in degrees between Alexandria and Aswan was 7 degrees, 14 minutes, 1/50th the circumference of a circle. He applied the physical distance between the two cities and concluded that the circumference of the Earth was 40,000 kilometers. This isn't the correct number, though his methods were perfect. At the time, it was impossible to know the precise distance between Alexandria and Aswan. If we apply Eratosthenes' formula today, we get a number astonishingly close to the actual circumference of the Earth. In fact, even his inexact figure was more precise than the one used by Christopher Columbus 1700 years later. Had he used Eratosthenes' estimation, Columbus would have known immediately that he hadn't reached India. Granite is an incredibly solid form of rock. To cut this rock in one solid huge piece, to create these things, is mind-boggling. Even to envision such an undertaking and to then have the confidence to go on and achieve points to the fact that they knew they could do these things. A task that would be daunting in the today and now, and in fact, if these things didn't already exist, then it's hard to imagine coming up with the idea for an obelisk as a monument, unless it had other more profound usages. The oldest obelisks are almost impossibly old, ancient even by the standards of antiquity. Seton Schroeder, an engineer who helped bring Cleopatra's Needle to Central Park, called it a mighty monument of hoary antiquity, and commented eloquently, "From the carving of its face, we read of an age anterior to most events recorded in ancient history. Troy had not fallen, Homer was not born, Solomon's temple was not built, and Rome arose, conquered the world, and passed into history during the time that this austere chronicle of silent ages has braved the elements." What do you guys think about the ancient obelisk? Comments below, and as always, thank you for watching.